All right, so good morning, guys. Today we're going to start some exciting stuff, I think. This is for the remainder of the year, we're going to be covering gastrointestinal herbs. I think this is a great area in herbal medicine. It's probably one of the most practical uses of herbs, and I would say that this is an area that naturopaths, gastrointestinal disorders, is an area that naturopaths get uh, I think in general, great results using herbs and dietary changes. And we see a lot of people who go and see doctors and gastroenterologists and don't get the results they want, or are on chronic drugs, and you can get a lot of them off of those using herbs, but also dietary changes as well. Uh, so, the approach we're going to take for this is we're going to start off and we're going to discuss the medicinal actions that are used for the gastrointestinal tract. You're going to be familiar with some of these terms. There's going to be a lot of repetition, but I'm hoping repetition will help you remember it. And we're going to be kind of looking at these herbs and this topic from a few different angles. One thing when it comes to actions is uh, many herbs, or I'd say all herbs, have multiple actions associated with that herb. So there may be a primary action for that, like a single one that people think, oh, yes, that's what I think of when I think of that particular herb. But there will be lots of other actions associated with it as well. And just because I haven't listed it in the slides doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I'm trying to simplify the herbs as best I can to kind of give what are the main actions and trying to make it easier to remember that way by explaining some of the phytochemicals that are associated with the plant uh, and some of the actions. And I'm not listing precisely what conditions you use those herbs for, but based on the actions, you should be able to deduce what you would use that herb for. And when it comes to a lot of these herbs, there may be multiple phytochemicals associated with a single herb, and chances are the medicinal actions may be associated with one or even half a dozen or more of these phytochemicals. So that's why, unlike a drug where you have a single compound in it, these herbs have multiple compounds with multiple actions. And there's going to be primary actions and there's going to be secondary actions. And when you look at a herb that's been used traditionally in some cultures, you might have a herb used, let's say, by one tribe in the Amazon primarily as a, let's say, a laxative, and then you could see it used by another herb or by another tribe as an antimicrobial. And they're both correct. Both of these herbs have those actions and those indications for it. And so there isn't just one herb used for one condition. There's a lot of uh, variability based on what is available, how much something costs, based on the taste and a number of other things. Um, so when it comes to selecting a herb, one of the ways that you do it is you look at the case and you figure out what are the main symptoms that the person's presenting with. And based on that, you kind of figure out what actions you want to select for the herb or the herbal formula you want to give that person. And then you select your herbs based on that, and you give it. So actions are a nice way to sort of simplify and break down a case of someone who's coming to see you to figure out what herbs you want to give them. When it comes to the herbal actions, you could have, let's say, an anti-inflammatory herb. And there are different ways that an anti-inflammatory drug or herb could reduce inflammation in the body. And it may be that it's reducing or maybe inhibiting certain enzymes like cyclooxygenase 2 or leukotriene synthesis. It could be affecting nitric oxide synthase enzymes, all sorts of different mechanisms. And so traditionally, we didn't understand, like 1,000 years ago or even 100 years ago, maybe how some of these herbs work. The science is emerging now. And in my opinion, if you're able to create a formula that has a few different herbs that work by different mechanisms, then you're more likely to have like a synergistic effect or more effective herbal treatment than just giving more of the same thing. And when we're going through a lot of these herbal actions that we're going to discuss, many of the herbal actions are unique to herbal medicine. Some of the actions we're going to discuss, like anti-inflammatory, for example, that exists in the pharmaceutical realm as well. But herb actions like carminative and bitters, demulcents, those terms aren't really used, as far as I know, in conventional medicine. In some cases, when you're looking at the actions that I've selected, though there will be synonyms for these actions. So one book may call it, like, for example, an anti-ulcer herb. Another book may call it ulceroprotective. There's slight differences between the terms, but essentially they're the same. And so you wouldn't have a herb with being both an anti-ulcer and an ulceroprotective. Like one book may use one herbal action, the other book may use another one. So, but they're essentially the same. So, and sometimes there's some redundant actions that you'll see as well, where you may include a few different things, but there's no point in sort of including both. Now, the final thing when it comes to herbal actions, a certain herbal action could be associated with, like, the gastrointestinal tract. Like bitters is generally associated with just digestion, although it can have effects on the entire system. Like when you improve digestion, you can improve, often bitter herbs will have a positive effect on detoxification organs, and also maybe on the pancreas and some other things. So they may have a beneficial effect on other systems like the endocrine system, because it may help with weight loss, or that may help with improving the skin. So when we're looking at these herbs, I'm only focusing on the gastrointestinal section, but many of the herbs and many of these actions could appear when you guys are learning, let's say, the respiratory tract, where you're learning about the musculoskeletal system. There'll be some repetition there. So I'm only focusing on certain herbs that I've selected for this. Now, the final thing is that I'm choosing a few herbs. Like, for example, when we're talking about some of the digestive herbs, like a carminative, the big ones are things like peppermint, fennel. Those would be like two that I might only mention in these slides. But you could also include dill, caraway, anise, coriander, tarragon. Like, there's all sorts of different herbs that would have similar actions, and you wouldn't be wrong to use those herbs. And if you had those in your garden, I would use them. If you had a case where you wanted to treat, let's say, a family member or yourself, you could certainly use those. So it's worth knowing, other herbs that have similar actions. I'm going to kind of explain how these herbs work. So if you understand how one of them works, and you see other herbs that have similar phytochemicals, you can probably deduce what the herb's going to be used for. So although I'm only focusing on a few herbs, I wouldn't say that peppermint oil is superior to caraway oil, or that fennel is superior. You might just end up having a preference based on the way it tastes. Some people don't like the taste of fennel because it tastes like licorice, and people have an adverse, or they just don't like the taste of it. So there are different ways that you can, create herbal formulas for patients, and there isn't one way that is definitively superior than another way. But I would say there are certain actions that you shouldn't be using for certain cases, and that would be a right and a wrong thing to do. So there is a gray area, but then there's also things that you just shouldn't do because it's contraindicated as well. Okay. I saw a couple questions come up here. On the herbal formulation slide, C stands for both with, okay, I will come back to that one later because I don't understand the question right now. So someone is saying for the midterm exam, many of us had the same marks for Bot Med and for Asian Med. That I have nothing, I know nothing about that. You'll have to speak to admin about that, but that seems a little suspicious to me. I know what my marks are on my slides, so you better find that out. I missed these questions. So those are applying to a different slides. I'll come back to those after on break. So here's a list of herbal actions commonly associated with the gastrointestinal tract. I think I got most of them. I may have missed a couple here and there. Those would be the main ones. And I don't think you need to memorize this slide. This is kind of a way that I understand that my brain kind of formulates and sort of creates an association with a lot of these herbal actions and how they're associated with each other. And maybe I'll come back to this afterwards. Some of these have opposing actions, like an antiemetic and an emetic. That's why I put a little red line there. Some of them have sort of strongly associated with them. For example, digestive bitters also have a choleretic and a cholagogue effect. And some things are kind of loosely associated. But I don't know if that helps you or not, but I'll come back to that later on. So one of the first things I'm going to start with when it comes to herbal medicine and the gastrointestinal tract is digestive bitters. And digestive bitters have a long history in herbal medicine. All around the world, people have been consuming bitter tasting plants since the beginning of time. And one of the things that I would say is when it comes to bitters, if you look at this from an evolutionary standpoint, assuming you believe in evolution, there was once a time where we were running around in the forest and the fields and wherever we were, gathering plants, eating leaves off the ground, even eating fruit. And most of these things that we're gathering had bitter phytochemicals associated with that. And plants produce these bitter phytochemicals to deter animals from eating certain parts of them, or these bitter compounds might have some antimicrobial properties associated with it. So it's basically to protect the plants in a lot of ways. Now, many of these bitter compounds also have a toxic effect if you take high amounts of them. So from an evolutionary standpoint, we would naturally have a slight aversion to consuming things that were too bitter, because a lot of these bitter things could be poisonous. And when you look at the pharmaceutical realm, the most potent drugs that are out there taste very bitter. Like a lot of the alkaloids that are really, really dangerous will taste bitter. And so I would say that when you look at humans and their diet, bitters have been an integral part of their diet forever. However, recently, in maybe the past few hundred years, and even in the past couple decades, through crop selection and breeding and genetically modifying things, those bitter components are slowly being removed from the diet. And when you look at, even the other day, I had a grapefruit and it wasn't very bitter. And I remember as a child, grapefruit was extremely bitter. And I think that a lot of what's happening, because people don't like the taste of bitter things, the farmers and the producers are selecting those things that are less bitter. And as a result, people have less bitter things in their diet. However, these bitter compounds, and I would say this applies to anything. If we've evolved being exposed to something and you suddenly remove it, problems will arise. And we know this is the case. When you look at like sunlight, for example, sunlight is a nutrient. We've been around it for thousands of years. And then dermatologists are telling everyone, don't get any sunlight. You're going to get skin cancer and die. And it's going to cause, wrinkles and all these things. But when people remove sunlight, then they're going to develop vitamin D deficiencies. It's going to affect their immune systems. And so there's a lot of health benefits from getting sunlight. And with regards to skin cancer, yes, you get skin cancer if you're exposed to sunlight, and you have to be careful about it. But what the dermatologists are failing to tell you is that sunlight also protects you against colon cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer. It helps with cardiovascular disease, it lowers stress, it helps with depression. So, like everything we've discussed so far, it follows that J curve. A small amount is good for you, or a moderate amount is good for you. High amounts is bad for you. And that goes, when astronauts go into space and they no longer have gravity. We've evolved having gravity. If you remove gravity, there's problems. People get they get osteoporosis. They develop, puts, strain on their internal organs. And the list goes on and on. And I would say when it comes to our diet, looking at a diet that's similar to what we evolved to consuming is probably going to be a very healthy type of diet. And there's no such thing as the perfect diet. There's books written on the topic of what is the best diet. I would say in general that a diet rich in plants that are rich in phytochemicals is going to be good for you. And eating less animals is probably a good thing as well. When it comes to these bitter compounds, what I suspect has happened though in the past is that when you consume small amounts of bitter compounds in your diet, it likely signaled to your body that there was a meal coming. And maybe it was used as a cue. Maybe your body recognized that bitter was associated with eating food. Therefore, it was used to basically stimulate your digestive function. And with the removal of these bitter foods from our diet, and when people are tending to go more towards a very sweet, carbohydrate-rich, sugar-rich diet, people aren't getting that same digestive cue. And it's not surprising that a lot of patients get indigestion, things like bloating and gas, heartburn, symptoms like that are often a result of not consuming enough bitter foods in the diet or a poorly functioning digestive tract. And so I'll come back to that in a second. And when you look at cultures around the world, Europe, for example, I'm displaying a whole bunch of different liqueurs that you can buy at the LCBO. Each one of these liqueurs is basically a herbal formula that's used to treat digestive conditions or to prevent or to help stimulate digestion. And so these contain herbs that are rich in bitter components and also rich in essential oils. Some of these are rich in essential oils. And so having, let's say, Campari on the rocks might be a drink you have before a meal or after a meal to help promote digestive function. Some cultures will use when they have a martini, and a martini has vermouth and bitter herbs in there that help to stimulate digestion, or you could have a gin and tonic, which would also stimulate digestion. So lots of these things exist, and I think from a cultural standpoint, we've been consuming these herbs for a long time. And most of the herbs that are in these liqueurs that I'm showing here would be ones like gentian, would be one of my favorite herbs for digestive issues, or artichoke, or wormwood, or what's that one called? Archangelica. And the list goes on and on and on, and all sorts of different ones. So those would be examples of things that might be consumed as a liqueur. And then there are other bitter herbs that are consumed maybe as a vegetable. So you could eat artichoke as a vegetable, or you could have radicchio or arugula or romaine lettuce or mescal mixtures or dandelion leaves, or drinking roasted dandelion roots or chicory roots and things like that. These are all used as digestive bitters. And they all have the same effect on the digestive tract. I'll get to that now. So bitter tonics, what that refers to is when you hear about like a tonic is something that tonifies that system. And so tonic water is, that name came from a digestive tonic, okay? A tonic, when it tonifies it, like if you're at the gym and you're tonifying your muscles, they have a little more muscle tone to them. They're not flabby, you know, they're looking healthy and active. And if something's not toned, it just looks kind of out of shape or flabby. And so a bitter tonic or a digestive tonic, could be used interchangeably, that name, is something that will stimulate digestive function, increase appetite, and help you break down food. And so these bitter tonics, I would say consuming them daily is a good thing to do. And that could be in the form of eating a salad with meals would be one way to do it, assuming the salad's not just iceberg lettuce, which is essentially crispy water. Don't get me wrong, I like the taste of a little bit of iceberg from time to time with in a sandwich, but there are better herbs and plants that can be used to promote digestion than iceberg lettuce. I mean, it does have some bitter components, but it's pretty minimal. So treating indigestion. So indigestion just means that there's, you eat a meal and you're not feeling well. Bitters can be used to help stimulate digestion, because if you're not breaking the food down effectively, you're going to have some problems and it'll develop digestive issues. Atonic digestion is something you see in a lot of the classic herb books. So atonic means poor tone. So it makes sense, if you have poor tone to your digestive tract, you give a bitter tonic. And so atonic digestion means there's nothing wrong with the person per se. They just need to have their digestion stimulated. And we'll discuss this in more detail later on. And that may be related, atonic digestion is often related to just poor appetite. So someone could have poor appetite because they're stressed out, or they're recovering from an illness, or elderly patients sometimes won't have great digestion. Could be a number of reasons for it. So bitters can be used for that. Bitter tonics also have beneficial effects on not just the stomach per se, but also on the gallbladder and liver function. And so it can be used to treat gallstones. Now, there would be other herbs that we'll talk about that are usually selected for gallstones. And so the action for gallstones could be bitters, but bitters are also associated with being what's called a cholagogue and a choleretic, and we'll talk about that later on. And that particular action is usually selected for gallstones, although bitters would not be wrong, because all bitters also act as choleretics and cholagogues. And finally, when people have sluggish bowels, that can be due to a number of things. And one of the contributing factors is when you consume a bitter substance, it tonifies the digestive tract. And when you're breaking food down better, and when you're stimulating the release of digestive juices, that does have an effect on the bowels and can have a very gentle laxative-like effect. Bile, which is also released by digestive bitters, it does have a slight irritating effect to the intestinal tract, and that helps to promote peristalsis and get the bowels working. So it's not uncommon when people have poor digestive function, they often have sluggish bowels that go along with it. Now, when it comes to phytochemicals, I would say that the primary types of compounds that are associated with this digestive bitter action are alkaloids and various lactone compounds. It doesn't mean that all compounds, that only those compounds have that effect, but those are some pretty big ones. So when it comes to alkaloids, appreciate when you have a nitrogen-containing compound and you taste it, it will taste bitter. But some of those alkaloid compounds have a stronger effect on the nervous system that could override the natural digestive bitter effect. And what I mean by that is when you consume a bitter herb, there are bitter receptors on your tongue that get stimulated that causes the release of your digestive juices. So if you ate something, let's say, if you took opium, for example, and put it in your mouth, it would taste bitter. However, the effects of opium on the nervous system is basically to suppress digestive function. And so it would cause, it would shut down your stomach acid and your gallbladder and your bowels, in addition to having an analgesic effect. And so certain alkaloids would not necessarily be associated with this digestive bitter tonic, even though they taste bitter. So not all things that taste bitter have a bitter tonic effect. And the alkaloids that affect the nervous system by suppressing it, like the anticholinergic ones, the tropane alkaloids, or the, which other ones? Some of the opioid ones would as well, would not fall into that category. With the herbs that we're going to discuss, isoquinoline alkaloids, quinoline alkaloids, purine alkaloids, those, for the most part, act as digestive bitters. Also, when we're talking about the terpenoids, there are subclasses of some of the terpenoids which we refer to as the lactones. So the monoterpene lactones, like the iridoids and secoiridoids. Some of those compounds are found in olive oil and olive leaf. Some of them are found in herbs like gentian that's used to promote digestion. Sesquiterpene lactones are found in a lot of the members of the Asteraceae family, and that's one of the largest family of plants, and that contains your classic daisy-like flowers, but also a lot of the thistles. So compounds that are found in, for example, artichoke would contain sesquiterpene lactones. Also, chicory and dandelion leaves and roots often, and even garden lettuce will contain these lactones, the sesquiterpene lactones. And then there are other lactones called diterpene lactones. Some of these are found in, there's a few plants like, for example, horehound is a herb used for respiratory tract infections. It's a very, very bitter herb. And so its primary action of horehound is usually it's used for respiratory tract infections, but it can also be used as a digestive bitter. So it's not one that I will include in my slides here, but when you're learning about the respiratory tract and some of those herbs, you'll see that there's herbs mentioned there that are digestive bitters. You'll be like, hey, why didn't he teach us that? And it's not that you couldn't use them. I just chose not to because there are ones that I prefer. But if all I had was horehound around and that's the only tincture I had in my kitchen at the time, and someone had indigestion, I would use it. So it's good to understand all the actions, but in reality, it's hard to memorize everything right off the bat. So there's lots of different herbs that are associated with that. So the way that digestive bitters appear to work, and it took me a while to find some research on this because a lot of my favorite herbs that are used as digestive bitters don't have a lot of research to support them. There's minimal. There is some that's emerged regarding how bitters may work, but it's not fully elucidated. There's no major clinical trials to support most of these as well. But from what I gather, when you stimulate a bitter receptor in your mouth, it appears to cause a release of gastrin and cholecystokinin. And these hormones, they kind of have slightly opposing actions to it. So I don't know, it's probably far more complex than this. But one of the things that gastrin does is it's responsible for increasing stomach acid. And so when you take a digestive bitter, you're stimulating stomach acid, and also in order to keep that stomach acid in the stomach, it tends to tighten up that lower esophageal sphincter, which is responsible for keeping acid and other food contents from moving upwards. So gastrin helps to break proteins down and keep foods descending. Cholecystokinin, it does have a slightly opposing effect. It does have a bit of a relaxing effect on some sphincters, but the main thing that it does is it stimulates the release of bile from the gallbladder and also pancreatic enzymes from the pancreas. And so it will help with further breakdown of protein, but also carbohydrates, and the bile will help to dissolve fats. So essentially, when you take something that's bitter, one of the first things that you'll notice is your mouth starts to salivate. And so when you take a bitter herb, you'll start to salivate, and then your stomach will grumble a little bit. And you may or may not feel the cholinergic effect, but there are other digestive juices being released. And as I mentioned before, sometimes when people have a bitter tonic, it can actually induce a bowel movement. And I know that we were traveling with some friends out west, and their child, which hadn't had a bowel movement in a long time, it was days anyways, and was being very, very difficult. And just as an aside, that child had food intolerances, but the parents, it's not my job to tell them what to do, but basically the kid had food intolerances and was drinking dairy formula instead of breast milk, and wasn't tolerating it. And so because this infant was in such GI distress and was miserable and everything, and because we're relocated, we had limited things available, and basically we gave him some gentian, which is a digestive bitter, give him a good little squirt of that. And it's normally used just to promote digestion, but that was enough to sort of, I guess the baby probably never tasted bitter before, so the reaction from the body was basically to get rid of this substance, and so it basically caused fully evacuated the bowels, and the child was happy. So it wasn't, as I mentioned earlier, bitters aren't normally used as a laxative, but they can often work that way. And in this child's case, it worked great. So those actions that I've listed there, salagogue, stomachic, cholagogue, cholinergic laxative, we're going to discuss later as well. But those actions are all associated with bitter herbs. Now, appreciate there are other herbs that are not bitters that can act as a stomachic or a salagogue or a laxative. But I would say all digestive bitters essentially have that indication. So if someone tells you, oh, this is a digestive bitter used for promoting, digestion, then by deduction, you can probably, I would say it'd be safe to say it's going to act as a salagogue, a stomachic, cholagogue, cholinergic, and probably a mild laxative. Okay. Now, in general, one of the things that you have to be careful with bitter tonics is because they stimulate stomach acid, in some cases of heartburn, it could make it worse. Now, often these, let's say, heartburn, just to explain, can be caused by either reflux that's causing acid to go into the esophagus, or it's caused by acid kind of burning a hole in the wall of the stomach. And in some cases, bitter tonics can make heartburn better, and in some cases, it can make it worse. So I'll discuss that later on. But what you'll see is, in general, a lot of the warnings on, or cautions associated with digestive bitters is caution giving it to people with heartburn, or contraindicated with someone who has a stomach ulcer. And that's because if you have a stomach ulcer, you really don't want to be stimulating a lot of acid. The list of digestive bitters is pretty extensive. In practice, if I need a digestive bitter, I use yellow gentian, I would say 99% of the time. And the reason why is because it's extremely bitter. It's probably the bitterest herb that we're going to discuss. Literally, you could just give 1 drop or 5 drops to someone, and that will be enough to stimulate their digestive function. So it's very cost effective, and it's just a great herb. But there are other ones that can be used. Wormwoods, which is one of the classic herbs found in absinthe, the liqueur, can be used. I don't use this as much for a few different reasons, but I have used it for some specific conditions. Golden seals is a useful digestive bitter, and I do sometimes use it as a digestive bitter, but it's not the primary reason why I chose it. If I only need like a digestive bitter, I would go with yellow gentian. If I need something if the person has a few different things going on, in addition to having poor digestion, they have possibly a parasite, I might go with golden seal or barberry as an option, along with some other things. And that would be like the secondary action that I'd be looking for. But because of the cost of golden seal, and it's not as bitter as yellow gentian, I wouldn't necessarily go with that. Other herbs like Garden Angelica, for example, it's often found in a lot of different liqueurs like chartreuse and some other liqueurs. It's a bitter, it has some essential oils in it, so it also has a bit of sometimes referred to as an aromatic bitter or carminative as well as a bitter. So I don't use it a lot. Occasionally it's in my formulas. Globe artichoke, it's not that bitter tasting compared to yellow gentian, but it definitely has these bitter compounds in it. And it will be used. Cinchona tree, again, quinine, which is in tonic water, comes from cinchona tree. So I've never used cinchona tree or quinine bark, or has a number of different names, as a herb, but I've drank tonic water quite a bit. Coffee is another great bitter herb. I think a lot of people consume that. And consuming black coffee does act as a digestive bitter, and it does appear to helps to improve digestion. So having a little espresso after dinner can help promote digestion. There's even research. One thing I saw in practice is that because bitters also stimulate the release of bile, when you look at coffee, I've noticed that in practice, most of my patients who have Gall Stones tend not to be coffee drinkers, or they drink a lot of cream and sugar with it. And it appears that coffee consumption appears to have a protective effect against gallstones, presumably because it's stimulating the release of bile. And then finally, boldo is a herb used in South America for a number of different digestive complaints, and it's another great digestive bitter. So when you look at the list, many of these herbs grow around the world. Wormwood, yellow gentian grows in the Alps. Wormwood grows it grows around here, it grows in Europe. Golden seal is exclusively kind of a Canadian or a northern U.S. plant. Barberry grows all around the world. Different varieties of it does. Oregon grapes primarily grows on the west coast, but I've now seen it growing a lot, and it grows. Lots of people are growing it as an ornamental plant here. Garden Angelica is mainly in northern Europe. I don't think it grows around here. Artichoke is cultivated everywhere, but originates in the Mediterranean. Cinchona bark, again, South America. Coffee grows anywhere in the tropics. And then boldo is mostly a South American plant. These are just a few different little studies that are talking about possibly how these things work to stimulate digestion. Now, another term which is related to the bitters is a stomachic. A stomachic, that refers to something that aids and supports the function of the stomach. So a stomachic will stimulate digestive function, kind of help to increase appetite. And so it has a lot of the same indications. All those bitter herbs we talked about will have a stomachic action associated with it. But there are certain herbs, like, for example, marijuana. Marijuana, when people smoke it, it increases appetite, and it's having an effect with promoting digestion or appetite, but it has nothing to do with bitter receptors. Also, ginger is also used as a stomachic because it helps improve digestion through some other mechanisms. That may be that it's working through serotonin receptors, through some of the essential oils. But some herbalists will refer to it as a pungent bitter. It's not a true bitter because it has that pungent, that warm, so the heat associated with ginger, but it definitely has a stomachic effect and does improve digestion. So ginger can have a similar effect as some of these other digestive bitters we talked about it, even though it doesn't have those bitter constituents in it. Again, like the bitters, stomachics, you have to be careful with heartburn because it could make it worse. It could make it better, but it could make it worse. Cholinergic and cholagogue, these two terms are closely related. So chol refers to cholesterol. I'll give you the breakdown for the name for this. So cholesterol is the building block for making bile. So that's why choleretics and cholagogues are referring to the effect that they have on bile. Now, if you have a diuretic, as you know, increases the production of urine. A cholinergic increases the production of bile. And so your liver is primarily the organ that makes bile, and it synthesizes it and then releases it, and then it gets stored in the gallbladder. A cholagogue refers to something that stimulates the expulsion or the release of bile from the gallbladder. So my little way of remembering it is cholagogues, there's go in it, it makes the bile go. Cholinergic, like a diuretic, increases the production, okay? So cholagogues and choleretics, in my opinion, they're often go hand in hand, especially when it comes to bitters. If you're consuming a bitter, it will stimulate the production of bile in the liver and the release of bile from the gallbladder. I think it does both things, to the best of my knowledge. I mean, it could be far more complex than that, but it doesn't really matter. All you know is that these guys usually go together. And so why would you want to do this? Primarily if you had a big meal of fish and chips, if you consume a lot of fat and your body cannot absorb all that fat, you're going to get steatorrhea, meaning like fat diarrhea pretty much, because all that fat will remain in the bowels. It'll act as a stool softener, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if your bowels are a little sluggish, but it can also create some urgency and discomfort and cause some digestive pain. So if you're getting indigestion because you've eaten a really heavy fatty meal, consuming bile will help absorb that fat, improve the digestion of it, and get things moving along. Because too much fat, if it just sits in your stomach, can lead to reflux and other problems as well. With people who have gallstones, one of the causes of gallstones is that the gallbladder just isn't functioning properly. Bile is just sitting there and saturating the gallbladder, leading to the cholesterol, which is the primary thing that's the body's trying to excrete that way. It'll start to form these little crystals and precipitate out of solution and eventually lead to gallstone formation. And so if you've got cholestasis, where stasis meaning static as opposed to dynamic, the gallbladder is static, it's not moving. This can occur if you're not eating a lot of bitters in your diet, but also with certain medical conditions like pregnancy. I don't know if pregnancy is I don't know, maybe not a medical condition, but it's a thing. So pregnancy, some women are more likely to get gallstones during pregnancy, or if people are fasting, or if they have an eating disorder, or if they're on certain medications, or not drinking enough coffee. All these things can lead to cholestasis, which can cause gallstone formation. And then finally, choleretics and cholagogues are useful for people just trying to have to promote detoxification in the body, because a lot of substances are detoxified through the liver and then excreted through the gallbladder and using bile. So if someone's coming in and saying, "Oh, I want to do a detox protocol," even though people are, I think, natural therapists are often promoting detox, and other medical care practitioners are a little critical of people using that term. There is no doubt that when you eat healthy, you remove garbage and toxins from your diet, and you take things that promote the breakdown of food and the release of bile and increase the formation of bile, you're naturally just going to have a cleansing effect on the body and help to get things moving. Stagnant stuff in the body tends, when it accumulates, you're not going to feel as healthy as when things are being moved and getting rid of things that aren't supposed to be there. Now, one of the cautions you have to have with cholagogues and choleretics, more so with the cholagogues, is if someone has an existing gallstone and you stimulate the gallbladder to contract, it could cause a gallbladder attack, because these gallstones could end up getting pushed out into the common bile duct, leading to pain. Okay, so again, not unlike the bitters that can cause both heartburn, bitters and cholagogues can also cause gallstones, but often cholagogues and bitters are used to treat heartburn and gallstones as well. So it's like, use it to treat it, but use it with caution, because there's a few situations where it could make it worse. Now, another term associated with bitters often is what's called antilytics. Now, in Latin or Greek, a lith refers to stones. So if you've ever taken art or art history, lithographs is a type of print making that they use a big slab of stone where they use acid to dissolve the stone to make an area where they could then make prints from. So a lithograph, litho meaning stone, graph meaning picture. In this case, we've got antilytic refers to anti-stones. So an antilytic herb is used to treat stones that form in the body. And this term could be associated with gallstones. It can sometimes be associated with kidney stones as well. Those are the two main types of stones that I think people form that you'd use an antilytic herb for. And again, if that herb is stimulating the gallbladder, it's probably going to have an antilytic effect as well. Now, not all the bitter herbs necessarily have the antilytic indication associated with it, but I would say that probably all bitters have an antilytic action, even if it's not necessarily listed or used as that primary thing. So I know that herbs like dandelion and chicory, gentian, boldo, all these, artichoke, all these herbs have antilytic actions. One of the main antilytic herbs that often people have heard about are used in herbal medicine is boldo. It's a great herb, but like I said, I've used that to treat gallstones and it's been effective, but any of those other bitter herbs would potentially have that effect as well. And again, if you're trying to dissolve stones, you got to be cautious because it could precipitate an attack, and we'll talk about this in more detail later. Now, I have to run to the washroom. So I'm going to go, we'll do a washroom break a little early today because I have to go, and we will come back at 10:30, okay? Okay, I'm back. You guys, I won't start yet though. Just gonna look at the questions that came up. Oops. Okay, sorry I had to run off like that. Too many diuretics this morning. And big glasses of water and some adaptogen herbs that have a slight diuretic effect as well. And a shake. So, yeah, anyways, didn't mean to just run off, but couldn't wait. Okay, I'm going to go, there's a few quick little questions I'm going to answer here. I added it in the answer form in text. Camelia is asking, does C stand for both food with and food? And the reason why that's probably a little confusing is because the Latin abbreviation. Why can I not? You know, I can't get in here. There we go. Stupid thing. There. So the answer is yes. CC is the abbreviation for with food, and that's because cum sibo is the Latin name for with food. She also asked, do we need to know phase 2 inducers, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, it's in the slides. It could appear on the exam. It may not, but it could. A good question she also asked was, why is it when you make a cup of, let's say, peppermint tea, that you're able to extract the essential oils out, even though the essential oils aren't water soluble? And that's because when you're using, when you're making teas with a flower or a leaf, these are fragile plant material. So when you add the hot water to it, the essential oils and the water soluble things will kind of, well, the water soluble things will dissolve in the water. The oil will kind of get dispersed amongst the water, and like little small mini droplets of essential oils that when left to sit long enough, they'll slowly move to the top. Just like if you shake up oil and vinegar salad dressing. You shake it up, little oil bubbles and droplets will be interspersed amongst the vinegar, but then if you leave it long enough, that oil will go up to the top and it'll become biphasic, so oil and water will separate. So the essential oils don't dissolve in the water, they just become mixed up with it and then eventually separate. If you were to boil the tea on a stove long enough, they'll all evaporate off and make your house smell nice, but But yeah. Chloe's asking, is there any value in using formulas of bitters over just using a single bitter herb? And I would say the advantage of using herbal formulas for like a digestive bitter would be primarily to give it a different taste. And second would be if you need some other actions in addition to just the pure bitter, then you could use some other herbs in there. So generally speaking, in practice, I'll use a single digestive bitter like gentian for most things, mainly because it's cost effective. I can give someone a little 15 ml bottle of it, 30 ml bottle. It costs maybe 15 bucks, and they can use 5 or 10 drops of that because it's so bitter. That is usually all I do with people. Now, in some cases, I might make a digestive tonic up that has other things in it. So if I needed, let's say if I'm treating fatty liver disease and I wanted some other indications in there in addition to just the digestive bitter, maybe something that reduces cholesterol synthesis, has an antispasmodic effect, or whatever it is that I'm looking, I might add some other ones that could work synergistically. So, or I might add a demulcinin, depending if I'm treating heartburn. So it depends on what I'm doing, but you could use it by itself. And so the combinations aren't necessarily superior to using, well, I don't know if they're superior because no one's ever done any testing, but maybe they might be, I don't know. But certainly using a single one might be good. There are some, I think, bitter herbs that are superior than other ones. So dandelion's not that bitter. And so I don't know if it would be worth using it at 5-drop dosage. You'd have to use it in the therapeutic range. So, but you could use it alone as well, as a leaf or as a tea or something like that for sure. Camille is asking, would adding licorice root to a decoction with any non-polar herb allow you to extract the herb in water and allow to get those non-polar substances dissolved in water? I think that's something that I suspect could be going on when you add saponins to formulas. Like in Chinese medicine, they'll often add licorice and ginsengs in a lot of formulas, and so maybe that helps get some of those non-polar substances dissolved because it acts as a soap. I think that's the case, but I can't say that for certain, but that would make sense to me. All right. So let's get back. Okay, so the next indication we're going to talk about is a hepatic. Hepatic, so HEPA means filter. So a hepatic is something that is associated with your body's filter, which is your liver. So hepatic substances are used to promote the function of the liver. And this is sort of a vague, it's not a specific, it doesn't explain exactly how they work. It's just a substance that is associated with liver. So it's been used to treat liver conditions. Liver conditions would be conditions that like jaundice, where the skin turns yellow, and that would be a result of some kind of problem in the liver. It could be due to other reasons, but that would be one thing. So people with chronic hepatitis, you might use a hepatic herb for it. You'd use hepatic herbs for people that maybe you thought they were toxic and their liver was overburdened. You might give them a liver herb to help support that. And there's some old conditions called hepatic torpor. Torpor just means sluggish or lazy. So hepatic torpor would be a patient who's coming in and their liver just seems to be burdened or not functioning optimally. And so giving hepatic herbs can help improve liver function in general. And I would say that most liver herbs, probably many liver herbs, if not most of them, have a digestive bitter action associated with it as well, but not all of them do. So when you look at bitters in general, will increase bile flow and bile production, and indirectly that can help with liver function. but they may or may not have some other actions associated with some of these hepatic herbs. So milk thistle, for example, it's not like, it's a little bit bitter, but it's not nearly as bitter as some of the herbs like gentian or even chicory and chelidonium, as far as I'm concerned. And so the function of something like milk thistle is its actions are associated with other compounds beyond just those bitter constituents. So, as we mentioned earlier, milk thistle has some hepatoprotective effects. I think we talked about it during the safety thing. Stimulates glutathione production. It helps with liver regeneration. So it's a good little herb for the liver, and it's kind of the archetypal liver herb. Now, turmeric is a great anti-inflammatory herb. It's good for cancer, arthritis, and a number of other things. And it also has some positive effects on the liver in general. It has a hepatoprotective effect and seems to improve liver function in general. Chelidonium or greater celandine, sorry, there's two different ways you can write that, and I may use different ones, so that's why the Latin name's important to know for these guys. So greater celandine or chelidonium, it's an interesting herb because it's historically used for liver conditions. It's used for chronic jaundice. It's sometimes used for gall stones. It's used as a digestive tonic. Although, as I mentioned in the safety lecture, it has been known to cause drug-induced hepatitis. So, sometimes things that are good for you can be good for you because they may be a little irritating to something, and that sort of stimulates your body to do something about it. Like a laxative, for example, it irritates your bowels a bit, and that can often, or stimulating laxatives can irritate the bowels and get the bowels moving. So a little bit's good, but too much is bad. Chelidonium has some compounds that have been associated with drug-induced hepatitis. And so if you type it into PubMed, you'll see these little case reports come up. So I use it with caution, especially in high amounts or long term. I would use it with caution. Even though it has a positive effect on liver function, you have to be careful with it. Gentian, because it's a great digestive tonic, it also has been shown to have some hepatoprotective effects. So I feel comfortable using it long term. Chicory is another one. It's a digestive bitter. Galen, who was one of the early Greco-Roman physicians, referred to chicory as the liver's best friend, or a friend of the liver. And in the Mediterranean area, they would have been consuming this, I assume, as maybe as some of the as a food as well as a medicine. And so it's just used. Nice thing about chicory, unlike a lot of the other ones mentioned there, you wouldn't sit down and eat a bowl of milk thistle or chelidonium. And gentian's not something that you would eat as a vegetable. None of these would you eat as a vegetable, with the exception of chicory. Might be something you would eat you could eat literally on a daily basis. And there's a few different species of chicory that can be consumed, and endive, and I forget what the other one's called, but these are all good things to eat regularly. So some of these herbs would be things that you might use acutely when there's a problem or for a specific condition, while other things might be something that you eat more as a food. So chicory is more like a food, while chelidonium would be more used for specific indications. So hepatoprotective is pretty self-explanatory. It's a substance that's going to help to protect the liver from some sort of chemical injury of some sort. Generally speaking, phenolic compounds tend to have a hepatoprotective effect because they act as antioxidants. And so the flavonoyl-lignans that we talked about earlier on, like the silymarin, which is found in milk thistle, has a direct hepatoprotective effect because those phenolic compounds help scavenge free radicals. And free radicals are often generated during liver detox phase 1 by certain compounds. Also, certain drugs and chemicals and environmental toxins will generate free radicals in the liver as well. And so many of the herbs that have an hepatoprotective effect have those phenolic compounds like the flavonolignin. The curcuminoids are found in turmeric, appear to have that hepatoprotective effect as well, by scavenging free radicals and also having an anti-inflammatory effect. And then flavonoids, which are found in most, I think probably every single plant has some kind of flavonoid in it. These also often will have an hepatoprotective effect as well. And so choosing herbs that have that hepatoprotective effect, you'd use it for general detox. If someone has some type of hepatitis, you might use it, or if they're, let's say, taking a particular drug like Tylenol long term, or maybe some chemotherapeutic drug or some other drugs that are damaging to the liver, it could have a protective effect. There is Amanita birosa, which is probably one of the most poisonous mushrooms. It damages the liver, and certain herbs like milk thistle may be helpful with that. And then finally, alcohol, which we all know damages the liver. If you consume high amounts of alcohol long term or even acutely, really high amounts can have a damaging effect on the liver. Some of these compounds could help prevent inflammation and cirrhosis. And I would imagine that an alcoholic that's eating a poor diet, like a lot of alcoholics do, who they're just not taking care of themselves. I would imagine that eating a plant-rich diet and being an alcoholic is probably going to be better for you than being an alcoholic and eating fast food, just because of the phytochemicals that would have a protective effect. Now, the best way to protect the liver is don't consume things that are going to damage it in the first place. And so, although herbs like milk thistle do have a hepatoprotective effect, the best way to reduce liver enzymes is don't get viral hepatitis. Don't drink excessively. Don't take drugs that damage the liver. Okay, so I don't want you to believe that if you take some kind of hepatoprotective herb that you've got the shield around your liver, then you can abuse it as much as you want and there won't be any consequences, because that's not the case. We know that eating a diet rich in fruits and vegetables helps lower the risk for, let's say, lung cancer, but it doesn't lower it by 100%. It maybe reduces it by 20% or 10% or whatever the number is. So there's an improvement, but you're still at risk of getting cancer. Just like if you're an alcoholic, you're still at risk of getting liver failure or cirrhosis, or if you're taking Tylenol, you're still going to be at risk of damaging the liver. But possibly these herbs can have a positive effect. And I've got some cases I'll show you later on how some of these hepatoprotective herbs can have a positive effect on liver enzymes. And liver enzymes are usually a marker of how much damage is occurring to the liver. So milk thistle, I pretty much always include that in the formula if I'm trying to lower liver enzymes. Turmeric's a good herb as well. It can be used in a supplement. I don't use it as much in tincture form. Licorice is another important hepatoprotective herb. Ginger, which is not its main indication. Usually I think of ginger as being an antiemetic to reduce nausea and vomiting. We'll talk about that afterwards. But because of the phenolic compounds in ginger, called gingerol, it has some positive effects as well. And then gentian, it's not its primary indication for it, but certainly it does appear to have that hepatoprotective effect. So somebody is asking a good question. So do we need to know the Latin names for all the bolded herbs, right? I would say you're going to need to know all the Latin names for both the common and Latin names for every single herb that I mentioned in the gastrointestinal section. And it's not that many herbs. I didn't ask you to memorize them for the beginning, but you do have to know them for the final exam. And the way that I'm going to do it is I'll have, let's say, 5 marks out of either 70 or 75 marks on the exam where you have to match up. Let's say, I'll say turmeric, or which of the following is the Latin name for turmeric? And you may be like curcumin glabra, Glycyrrhiza longa, Curcuma longa, or Gentian lutea, and then you'd match it up. And so it's an easy way to get 5 marks. You have to know those things for NPLEX. You have to know them for life. You just got to memorize these because this is just, unfortunately, just something you have to remember, okay? And if you don't know the Latin names later on, you could end up miscommunicating what herb you want to get, okay? So, yes, you do. Hepatoprotective. So, note this is on the left, turmeric's on the right. Those are 2 awesome herbs worth knowing. So, we've talked about digestive bitters, and they're used to promote digestion. And there's another herbal action that also promotes digestion through a slightly different mechanism. So, carminatives are things that promote digestion, relieve bloating and gas. And they have a different sort of indication or action on the body than digestive bitters. So although there may be some overlap with how they work or with what they treat, they work by a different mechanism. So when it comes to indigestion, indigestion is sort of an umbrella term for just feeling unwell after eating a meal. And so if you're not producing enough digestive juices, what can end up happening is you're not going to break down the food as effectively. So taking a bitter can help promote the breakdown of food. Carminatives, they can help promote digestion. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think they stimulate necessarily, like the essential oils. In some cases they might, but they may not stimulate the release of stomach acid and bile and things like that. Like as a general rule, I mean, some of them might through maybe some other kind of mechanism, but when people get indigestion, let's say because they're not breaking the food down, they may start feeling distended and food starts to sit in the stomach longer, or they may feel bloated, they may start generating a lot of gas. And so what the carminatives do is they're rich in essential oils, and they appear to increase blood flow to the mucous membranes of the digestive tract. Because just like if you apply essential oils topically to your skin, they can act as a rubefacient and increase blood flow to that area. When you take them internally, you may not see it, but probably they're causing the capillaries to dilate and increasing blood flow to those organs. And so that can have a positive effect just by redirecting blood flow to the area. It can help maybe make those mucous membranes work better, maybe promote mucus production. Maybe it might have some positive effect on stomach acid, I don't know. But the other thing they do is they tend to relax sphincters. And so if you've eaten a meal and the food's just sitting in your stomach because it's like you're feeling heavy and bloated because you overate, what the carminatives can do is they'll relax sphincters and allow the food to move. And so that way, if your stomach is feeling kind of heavy, it might kind of help to allow emptying of the stomach and get things moving along the digestive tract. And so they'll relax the sphincters, allowing the food to go down. But something to be careful about is they can also relax the lower esophageal sphincter, which separates the esophagus and the stomach. And that could allow food to reflux upwards. So when people eat a lot of spicy food, sometimes when they burp, they may get a little bit of acid, refluxing or moving up into the esophagus, causing heartburn or a little bit of regurgitation of food in the mouth. And that's because of that carminative action of relaxing those sphincters. The other thing that carminatives do is, let's say if you've gone and eaten a whole bunch of refried beans and your gut flora is happily fermenting these fibers that you weren't able to break down, and it starts building up all this gas inside you and causing gas pains where there's cramping pains because the gas is built up and it's affecting peristalsis. What the carminative will do in that case is it'll help to relax those sphincters and help to normalize peristalsis. So it'll help to relieve some of the cramping pains, but also those sphincters in your intestinal tract will relax to allow the gas to travel through the system. So if you've eaten something, you're feeling this sort of distended and you feel there's a lot of gas building up, then by having something like a peppermint tea or some fennel seeds, consume those and then go for a little walk outside. And eventually, after a couple of minutes, you'll notice that things will start to move, and then you'll probably be able to pass the gas that may have been trapped in you before. So don't take the Carminative and then stay in the classroom, though. That wouldn't be nice to anyone around you. Okay. So the main phytochemicals associated with the carminatives are the essential oils. Okay. I don't think there's any other phytochemicals that have a carminative effect. So they work by a few different mechanisms, but mainly those essential oils cause those capillaries to dilate and have a normalizing effect on peristalsis. So peppermint tea, appreciate the peppermint tea is rich in essential oils. You can also do peppermint oil. Peppermint oil will have a carminative effect. There are constituents in peppermint that are different than the essential oils that have medicinal properties, but the carminative action is associated with those essential oils. Many of the little seeds that would be in your spice cabinet, like fennel, anise, caraway, what else is in there? Dill, coriander, all of those have a carminative action associated with it. So most members of the Apiaceae family, which I mentioned, the fennel, the anise, caraway, things like that, they will all have a carminative effect. Many members of the mint family, so peppermint, spearmint, oregano, thyme, rosemary, those essential oils will also have a carminative effect. Ginger has a few different constituents in it. Some of the components of it are essential oils, some of them aren't. And it has a few different things, but ginger tea, certainly drinking that, or ginger capsules would have, if it contains the essential oils, it'll have a carminative effect. But there are other phytochemicals that work through other mechanisms that have a similar effect as a carminative, but through interacting with different receptors. And then chamomile as well has essential oils and also has some flavonoids. So there's mixed actions there. So if you were to have a cup of chamomile tea or peppermint tea, there would be actions associated with multiple phytochemicals as opposed to if you only took the essential oil from those, okay? So as I mentioned, they increase the blood flow to the mucous membranes, relaxes smooth muscles, including sphincters, and helps to normalize the peristalsis. The main thing to watch out for with this is that it can aggravate heartburn. So peppermint in the mint family, fennel and anise and caraway, they're all in the Apiaceae family, and they all have this umbrella-like structure. Now just be warned that many of the members of the Apiaceae family look like this. They can easily be confused with one another, but there are a few poisonous plants in that Apiaceae family that essentially look the same as fennel, like poison hemlock and water hemlock. It looks almost the same, but it's not very good for you. And so here, I just grabbed a PubMed thing. Here's a peppermint oil capsules. They're treating IBS. So what they found was that with people who take the peppermint oil capsules, what they found is there is less abdominal distension. It reduced the diarrhea. Borborygmi basically is that gurgling, bubbling noise in the gut. So the essential oil can help to reduce the gurgling and the bubbling sounds. Decreases pain as well. So overall, had a positive effect. Now, appreciate that the peppermint oil capsules will be very concentrated and have higher amounts of the peppermint oil, which is mostly menthol, but there's a few other ones in it as well. Then it would be, so a cup of tea wouldn't necessarily be the same as having one of these peppermint oil capsules. A peppermint oil capsule might be equivalent of having 5 cups of tea. But you wouldn't be getting the flavonoids in the peppermint oil capsule because they're not essential oils. Okay, so differences between the two. I got another thing hidden behind there. What is that? 1 second. Oops. Oops. What's going on there? Oh, that's nothing. So, another important action is kind of associated with carminatives is an antispasmodic. So sometimes some of these herbal actions are like anti and then spasmodic, or it could be spasmolytic. So lytic basically means to break apart. So spasmolytic basically means to break up spasms, or antispasmodic means anti-spasms. Both of these words are acceptable terms and could be used interchangeably. And so when there is some kind of irritation to a smooth muscle, turn off webcam. When there's some kind of irritation to a smooth muscle, what will end up happening is that it'll cause it often to cramp up. And so you can get spasming of the intestinal tract. So if you're having, let's say, IBS, and there's a lot of cramping of smooth muscles in the intestinal tract, that could cause pain. So an antispasmodic herb could be used for that. But you also have these smooth muscles, not just in the intestinal tract, but you also have them, let's say, in the gallbladder and the common bile duct, the urinary tract. I'm assuming also some of the uterine muscles can become spastic. So antispasmodic herbs, the ones I'm talking about, like chamomile, wild yam, greater celandine, these are all great antispasmodics. But some of these can also be used not just for digestive issues, but also could be used for menstrual cramps, or could be used. So both greater celandine, wild yam, and chamomile have all been used historically for menstrual cramps. They've all been used for greater celandine and wild yam have been used for gallbladder spasms. So there are other indications. Now, the phytochemicals associated with antispasmodics could be a few different types of compounds. Some of these might be essential oils. So some carminatives are called antispasmodics. And I would say that most carminatives have an antispasmodic effect to some degree because they help to normalize peristalsis and they help to relax the smooth muscles. They may not be as strong as some types of phytochemicals. So some of them, like tropane alkaloids, these are those like anticholinergics that you get with like deadly nightshade, for example, or opium poppy. It's kind of a tropane. No, opium poppy is more like an isoquinoline alkaloid. Those types of alkaloids have a strong suppressive effect by inhibiting certain or blocking certain receptors in the body. So by blocking the muscarinic receptors, you're basically stopping contractions of the smooth muscles. And so as opposed to essential oils that tend to have a normalizing effect on peristalsis, certain things like deadly nightshade or opioids will have a suppressive effect and completely shut it down. So one of the big side effects of people taking opioid drugs like Tylenol 3 or any of the other opioids is it tends to cause pretty severe constipation. And that's just because it's shutting down those smooth muscles. And so historically, things like opium were once used for severe diarrhea, for example. Now, just as an aside, greater celandine, it's a cousin of the opium poppy. It does have opioid-like compounds in it, but it doesn't have the strong analgesic addictive components that opium does, and it's not an essential oil. Greater celandine and wild yam, the antispasmodic effects are not associated with the essential oils in it. It's associated with other compounds in it. Chamomile, it could be the essential oils. It could also be some of the flavonoids that have an antispasmodic effect. So again, when you look at some of the compounds, like in chamomile, the apigenin and some of the other flavonoids appear to have this antispasmodic effect, and we know that flavonoids are not essential oils. So lots of different phytochemicals can have an antispasmodic effect, and these are often a little bit stronger than just the essential oils themselves. Okay. And I would say that carminatives are very gentle, but if you were passing a gallstone, or if you had passing a kidney stone, or had really severe cramping pains in the intestinal tract, a cup of peppermint tea might help, but taking some atropine from deadly nightshade would probably relieve the pain. Be more effective at relieving the pain, but if you have a little bit of bloating and gas because you had some beans, you don't want to just take opium or deadly nightshade for that. Okay. So 11:02, I got a bunch of error messages. So 11:01 to 11:02, I got a bunch of messages saying that the audio and the visual is gone. How's the sound and stuff right now? How long did I lose you guys for? Is it all back to normal? Is there anything you guys need me to repeat? I think I got a little message on my end pretty quick. I turned off the video. Just give me 1 second. I want to ask. Hey, Kim, you're not doing anything with the internet, eh?
No, I was disconnected for a minute, but...
Okay, but you're fine now. Okay, thanks. Maybe it was just a little blip in our internet because my receptionist was affected as well. I'll turn the video back on for now. If it happens again, I'll just keep my eye on. Send me a quick message, and I'll turn it off if we need to. It may have just been a small little glitch. Okay, so the take home for antispasmodics is they help relieve spasming and cramping of smooth muscles. It's not just limited to the intestinal tract and the biliary tract. It can be used for things in the respiratory, like a spastic cough. It can be used for menstrual cramps. It can be used for kidney stones that causes renal colic. Some of these have a very gentle action, so most of those carminatives will have a very mild, gentle antispasmodic effect. And then when you start getting into the alkaloids, in particular, like the tropane alkaloids and the isoquinoline alkaloids, and some of those will be stronger. Okay. So wild yam, also called colic root. Colic is a term for cramping pain. It's used for a whole bunch of different types of cramping issues, including menstrual cramps and biliary colic and digestive colic. Greater celandine, again, has an antispasmodic effect, historically used for some liver issues and biliary colic. So in Latin, emesis refers to vomiting. So an antiemetic is something that helps to relieve nausea and vomiting. And in most cases, when you're feeling nauseous, when you have like nausea or you have diarrhea, your body's trying to get rid of something that's bugging it. And so in a lot of cases, I don't always want to suppress. If I eat something, if I get food poisoning, I want to vomit out that food. I want to get rid of it because I'm going to feel better if I can just purge it from the system. If I've got some kind of intestinal bug, I want to get rid of it. So diarrhea is a good thing to flush out the system, So vomiting and diarrhea is not necessarily a bad thing, but in excess, well, you could die in excess if you had too much vomiting, or if it was too severe, you could be damaging your intestinal tract, or causing internal bleeding and all sorts of bad things. So it's good in some cases to help reduce the nausea. And also, if the nausea is not leading to vomiting, if you're just nauseous because you're pregnant, which is a normal part of it, it would be nice to have some relief from that. Or if you had motion sickness and you're traveling on a boat and you get seasickness, or in a car, uh, avoiding reducing nausea would be a nice thing. Or if you're on chemotherapy, and you don't really have a choice, you have to be on it, then these antiemetic herbs can have a positive effect. And there's some great research to support um, a lot of these herbs. Now, ginger is the archetypal herb used for as an antiemetic, and there's great research showing that it's safe to give to women that are pregnant. So it's an amazing herb. You can buy it fresh. You can buy it in capsule form. Um, no concerns with it for pregnancy. Might have a little bit of a blood thinning effect. That would be the only concern I'd have with it. But otherwise, it's a great herb and it tastes nice. So that's something you can easily boil up and make as a tea. The other thing I like about ginger, it has a digestive tonic effect to some degree. It's not a bitter, but it's a pungent bitter. Helps protect the liver, helps with arthritis, decreases inflammation, has anti-cancer effects. It's awesome. Ginger's just a great herb, and it tastes great using your spices or in your cooking as well. So with pregnant women, they could do this as a capsule. They could have ginger candies. They could have ginger tea. So, and what's neat about ginger is, uh, if you remember going back to the serotonin receptors, certain ones, when you stimulate them, it causes nausea and vomiting. And so for example, when I was doing ayahuasca down in the Amazon, one of the things that happens in the 4 hour period that the herb affects you is it causes hallucinations, but it also causes nausea and almost always vomiting. And that's because it's interacting with certain specific serotonin receptors, which are the 5-HT3 receptors. When you stimulate those ones, it causes the vomiting. What's neat is ginger blocks that receptor to help relieve anxiety, but also help to suppress nausea and vomiting. So that's one of the ways that it works as an antiemetic. Peppermint tea, I don't know the precise mechanism, but there's research showing that it also helps relieve nausea. I find that traveling with some peppermint, like a strong peppermint candy, well, I won't mention any names, but often I'll have some of those or some ginger candies just when traveling, because it's nice if you're getting some motion sickness or you're not feeling great. You can just easily pop one of those. And yes, the sugar's not great in them, but I'm not eating a bag of these things. Just a few of them can help children respond well to having peppermints or ginger if they're feeling a little nauseous, and help relieve a tummy ache, which is good. And they're legal in every country. Now, marijuana, which is currently legal in Canada, and I think I have the prescribing rights, so I can prescribe it, which means it can be covered by certain healthcare plans, and they can get it through different channels. Marijuana is also a great antiemetic, and so people going through chemotherapy or who have some other chronic nausea can often get relief by either ingesting or smoking marijuana. And its mechanism is different than the ginger. It works through cannabinoid receptors to relieve nausea and can also promote appetite. So for people going through chemotherapy where they have no appetite and they feel nauseous, consuming marijuana can often improve their quality of life through that mechanism. Now, finally, deadly nightshade, which I'm not recommending you use, but it does have an antiemetic effect. It contains atropine, and there is a antiemetic drug called scopolamine, which is basically it's essentially the same as atropine, and it's a constituent in other members of the Solanaceae family that contain these anticholinergics, and it basically blocks the muscarinic receptors to relieve nausea and vomiting. And so scopolamine, which is a naturally occurring substance, I think it's found more in devil's trumpet. Um, It's sometimes recommended to people for motion sickness, but it's a lot stronger an antiemetic than ginger would be, and so and you could overdose, and it isn't exclusive just to the stomach. It's also going to have a negative or a suppressive effect on the entire gastrointestinal tract. It's going to cause pupil dilations. It's going to cause dry mouth. It's going to cause constipation, urinary retention. So not really ideal unless you have to use it because the symptoms are pretty severe. Okay. So I'm mentioning just a little bit of pharmacology just so you can appreciate that there are different receptors one can target to reduce vomiting. And so in addition, there's also dopamine receptors in the body that can be used and targeted. So certain drugs will target dopamine receptors as well. But the main herbs that we use, I would say ginger is the primary one, and it's working through serotonin. I wish I knew how peppermint works. So there's ginger on the left. There's marijuana on the right. And what's neat is peppermint, it's not just consuming it orally, but it may be that peppermint oil, the essential oil, just inhaling it may help to relieve nausea through some mechanism. So it may be that there's certain olfactory receptors in that when the menthol or whatever the essential oil is that it binds, I'm assuming it's the menthol, interacts with that receptor in the nose, it may help to relieve nausea through that way. So if you don't want to take anything orally, just smelling the essential oil from peppermint might have a positive effect. So we talked about the antiemetics. There's a whole bunch of herbs that can have an emetic effect as well. Now, I've never recommended a herb for its emetic properties. So an emetic basically induces vomiting. So I've never actually recommended, but it has been used historically in herbal medicine. These herbs do exist. The one that you can probably get your hands on is Indian tobacco. I have used Indian tobacco because in lower doses, it's used as an expectorant. It's great for respiratory conditions like bronchitis, where there's a lot of phlegm and mucus accumulating in the lungs, and you want to expectorate and help to cough that out. And so what happens if you take an emetic in a low dose, it stimulates your body to thin down and make more watery mucus, because before you vomit out all the stomach acid, you want to protect your esophagus and the mucous membranes from the acid, so your body actually produces more mucus to act as a barrier to help protect it. But that mucus that gets produced it doesn't only occur in the esophagus. It also has a reflex effect in the lungs as well. So if you've ever, I'm sure everyone out there is vomited at some point in life, and sometimes, like I always know, it's like you know what's going to happen. You can feel like you start salivating a lot. You're like, I know this is going to happen, and often you get a little bit of a warning sign. All that extra saliva and stuff, that's part of the whole process of generating more mucus to try to protect the esophagus. And so going back to the Indian tobacco, one of its primary indication is as an expectorant, because it stimulates the vomiting center in the medulla, and also gets all this increased mucus production. So low dose, you use it for the lungs. If you take a higher dose of it, it'll cause nausea and then eventually vomiting. And it certainly does that. So Indian tobacco or lobelia was used by Samuel Thompson in some of his formulas as like a purgative to kind of help to, or as a medic to help cause vomiting, and kind of seen in that culture as being back when they used to use things like mercury to basically purge out the system and cause vomiting because it was thought to be kind of cleansing for people. He didn't believe in that, but he still would use sort of Indian tobacco to act as a purgative. And even in certain herbal traditions, they'll use things and have little, like in Ayurvedic medicine, they'll get people to drink salt water and vomit it all up and then take gauze and swallow it and clean out their insides as part of some of these cleansing rituals. We don't tend to like vomiting in North America, but there is definitely can have a cleansing effect. So Indian tobacco is one herb for that. Ipecac, so Indian tobacco is on the left, Lobelia inflata. Ipecac is on the right. This grows in Central and South America. I've never recommended it to a patient. I took that photograph, I think, in Costa Rica. But if you go into most pharmacies, at least historically, syrup of Ipecac was used for accidental poisoning. So it's stronger than the Indian tobacco is. Just as an aside, Ipecac in low doses was used like Indian tobacco was for some respiratory issues, but it's not really a reliable one. It tends to cause vomiting a lot easier than the Indian tobacco is, so it's not generally recommended for that. But the Ipecac would be recommended as an emetic for some type of poisoning, okay? I think there was another herb, but what was there? Oh, Jabarandi, the Pilocarpus species. That also is an emetic because it stimulates muscarinic receptors. But again, that's not really a herb that, to the best of my knowledge, is well, maybe it's legal, but it would be flying under the radar if it's not. These are things you've got to be careful with. So anticholinergics, cholinergic or muscarinic receptors stimulate digestion. So they're going to increase the release of digestive juices like bile, stomach acid. They're going to stimulate peristalsis, stimulate salivation. Those would be the main things I can think of. So anticholinergics block all those things. So they tend to have an anti-secretory effect, meaning they suppress the release of secretions. They can suppress diarrhea as well because they're inhibiting peristalsis, and you need peristalsis for diarrhea. That's hyperperistalsis, or increasing peristalsis gets things to move along quicker. So if you shut it down, things aren't going to move, so you can reduce diarrhea that way. Anticholinergics have that antiemetic effect as well by suppressing vomiting, and also because smooth muscles are controlled by muscarinic receptors, by blocking them, you have an antispasmodic effect. So anticholinergic substances are generally used to, if the gastrointestinal tract is going crazy on you, it can be used to suppress it. So these are very powerful drugs. They're generally not used in herbal medicine. I would say if conventional doctors didn't exist and you had like a herbal hospital, then you would be using these in certain situations. But for, people don't come into me because they've got, because they're overdosing on something. They go to hospitals. So that's why we don't use these. We're not really, people don't come to us for serious acute care. They go to hospitals, and they should, by all means. But deadly nightshade, Jimson weed are anticholinergics. They have a place historically in herbal medicine. They do work. They're just dangerous, and you have to use them with caution. And so they could be used for motion sickness, because the drugs certainly are used for motion sickness. They could be used for vomiting, and they could also be used for severe cramping pains, like a severe, someone's passing a gall stone or a kidney stone, that may provide some relief with that. So deadly nightshade on the left, and Jimson weed on the right. We've already talked about those in the safety lecture. Demulcent herbs This is a unique action that doesn't, unlike the anticholinergics that you can find in the drug world, demulcents do not exist, to the best of my knowledge, in the, or at least they're not. That term isn't used in the drug world, in the pharmaceutical world. A demulcent is a substance that helps to soothe irritated mucous membranes by creating a protective coating or barrier. And so when you hear anything that ends with an itis in the gastrointestinal tract, so it could be, for example, esophagitis, which is inflammation of the esophagus that can be associated with heartburn or reflux. It could be gastritis, which is inflammation of the stomach that could be caused by H. pylori infection or too much alcohol or certain anti-inflammatory drugs, or inflammation of the colon, colitis. So itis basically means inflammation. That's where you use a demulcent for it. It's primarily used for the gastrointestinal tract, but demulcents can also be used for inflammation in the respiratory tract, like with bronchitis or what else? Bronchitis would be the main thing. You could also use it for inflammation of the urinary tract. So things like cystitis, like a urinary tract infection, or maybe a bacterial type of cystitis. And so there are a number of herbs that can be used. Marshmallow and slippery elm are two classic demulcents that are rich in mucilage. And so when you consume a substance that contains mucilage, that mucilage absorbs water and turns into like a slimy, viscous substance that when you drink it, it helps to kind of coat the esophagus and the stomach and the intestinal tract to help create that protective barrier. So the way that marshmallow and slippery elm work is they basically have a direct effect on those mucous membranes by creating like a physical barrier. Now, licorice can also be used as a demulcent. Now, it differs in the marshmallow and the slippery elm is that it does not contain any mucilage. It doesn't contain fiber that turns into slimy water. If you add licorice to water and shake it up, you'll see saponins are in there, but you don't have any mucilage. There's no slime, okay? So how does it work if it doesn't directly coat it? The way that it does that is that it has an indirect effect. It actually stimulates the body to produce mucus. And it does so by affecting certain production of prostaglandins that are involved with mucus creation. And so if you take an anti-inflammatory drug like aspirin or ibuprofen, diclofenac or indomethacin, those drugs basically inhibit certain prostaglandins that are involved with the maintenance of the lining of the stomach. So they inhibit an enzyme called cyclooxygenase 1, which makes prostaglandins that help ensure there's proper integrity of the intestinal tract and also make enough mucus to protect the stomach. And so licorice or DGL, which is a special type of extract from licorice, basically does the opposite for your stomach that ibuprofen and aspirin does, these anti-inflammatory drugs. It increases mucus production rather than produce it. So both marshmallow, slippery elm, and licorice, they all help protect those mucous membranes, but one does it directly by coating them with mucilage. The other one does it by stimulating mucus production. Okay, pretty cool stuff. So there's marshmallow and slippery elm. I use both those in practice. Slippery elm root or leaf can be used, tends to be more cost effective than the slippery elm powder. And, I guess I basically mentioned this before. So the main compound in licorice, and it took me a while to figure this out and track it down, but the main compound in licorice that is responsible for the demulcent effect is a compound called lycoflavone. So it's a type of flavonoid. It's sort of unique from the other ones. And it has basically, this is like a little isoprene unit that's stuck onto a flavonoid. And this compound, as I mentioned, it inhibits the breakdown of certain prostaglandins, the PGE2 and the PGF2 alpha, which is involved with mucus production. Okay. As an aside, if you look at this licorice on the left-hand side, the glycyrrhizin, which is a saponin that makes all this nice frothy soap-like stuff, that elevates blood pressure and is not required to have that demulcent action. So the deglycerinated licorice, DGL, can be purchased as a capsule and given to people with stomach ulcers or heartburn. And what they've done is they've removed the glycyrrhizin, which is the triterpenoid saponin. They've removed that compound, which is unnecessary and would be contraindicated for people with high blood pressure. And it contains primarily just this lycoflavone in it, and it can be very useful for heartburn. So I have used throwing licorice into a formula for people for heartburn, or if I wanted that demulcent effect. But if I'm giving it purely on its own, I would just go with the DGL. It's inexpensive and easy to find. So something that is can occur in the stomach is stomach ulcers, or can also actually can occur anywhere in the gastrointestinal tract. An ulcer basically is a wound that isn't able to heal. It's like if you scratch your skin uh, and then stop scratching it, it'll eventually heal up on its own. If you keep scratching it and you don't stop scratching, then eventually what happens is that wound is unable to repair and it will just end up leading to a chronic ulcer that's just bleeding and oozing and it is at risk of getting infections. And these can occur both internally and externally. So in the stomach, you might get a gastric or peptic ulcer. You can get them in your upper intestinal tract, so you could have a duodenal ulcer. And in some cases, you might get ulcerative colitis, where there's ulcers in the colon. And there are lots of different actions for this, and there's different herbal actions that you might that can have an anti-ulcer effect. So demulcents can have a positive effect by helping to coat the esophagus with mucus. You can help speed up the healing, suppress stomach acid, there's astringent. So I'll get to these afterwards. So anti-ulcer or anti-ulcerogenic is an umbrella term for things that help prevent ulcer formation. And I think I showed you these slides already in the for the topical formulations ones. So dragon's blood, which is a mixture of an astringent and a vulnerary compounds in a latex, when applied topically, you can see how nicely it helps to heal up those ulcers and gives it an opportunity for those ulcers to heal. This same herb can be used internally for chronic diarrhea, colitis, ulcerative colitis, stomach ulcers. Presumably, it's going to do a very similar thing on the inside as it would on the outside, which is good. So some of the herbs that have an anti-ulcer effect may be because they act as vulneraries. And I've mentioned what vulneraries are already. Vulneraries are compounds or herbs that help to speed up the healing of wounds. And these can be applied both internally or applied topically or taken internally. And some herbs are safe for both. Herbs like chamomile is probably your classic archetypal internal vulnerary herb. And so in the German herbal tradition, chamomile tea is a great thing to help with stomach ulcers. Yarrow has similar phytochemicals that chamomile does, and it's often used internally for vulneraries. I don't use it as much, even though it's a great herb, just because I tend to use chamomile because it's more widely available and tastes quite pleasant. Marigold or calendula is often used topically for burns and for wounds, but you can also use it internally for stomach ulcers as well. And English plantain, there's a few different species of plantain can be used both internally and externally for wound healing and for ulcers. Okay. The precise mechanism for these could be a few different ways, but most of these will modulate the inflammatory process in general to accelerate the wound healing. So chamomile, that's, in my opinion, one of the best ones to use. One, because you can make it as a tea. Two, it tastes pleasant. Three, it's easy to find. Four, it's cheap. But there are other ones you can use in combination that work by different mechanisms. So the chamomile is likely related to some of the flavonoids and some of the terpenoids in it. Marigold is also good. Other herbs that can help with wound healing are astringents. Astringents also have a great effect for not just wound healing, but for diarrhea as well. And as I mentioned before, the way that astringents work is they form a cross-linking with the proteins, and they kind of pull the damaged tissues together and help to dry up the mucous membranes. Many of these astringent compounds can inhibit certain enzymes involved with, let's say, making stomach acid. So astringent herbs generally will have an antacid effect as well. So astringent herbs, wound healing, internal bleeding, can be used topically for varicosities, internally for ulcers, and also for diarrhea. So you might want to throw ulcers on there. I didn't list it there, but it should be, it's kind of implied with the wound healing. But when it comes to internal astringents, a lot of the classic ones can be cranesbill, witch hazel, and oak are all strong astringents. Cranesbill grows in North America, and it's sort of one that First Nations people used in North America that's been adopted or integrated into Western herbalism. Witch hazel and oak grows in Europe as well. And bilberry is a type of blueberry that grows in Northern Europe that's very astringent. All those can be used internally. Bilberry would be the safest one to use. The other ones tend to be stronger astringents. So blueberries in general will have some astringency to it. Bilberries will be a little stronger. Cranesbill, as I mentioned, that's in a lot of the classic herbal formulas for diarrhea and any kind of internal bleeding. Antacids. There's a few herbs that I know that have a documented antacid effect. The classic archetypal antacid herb is meadowsweet, and meadowsweet appears to inhibit acid in the stomach. It's used for stomach ulcers, heartburn to some degree as well. It's pretty safe to take. Cranesbill is also used for that. It does have an antacid effect. I've even read, I think after I created the slide, I think chamomile also has a bit of an antacid effect as well. It's not strongly suppressive, but it does have that antacid effect. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it's so desirable for inflammation of the stomach, as it decreases the stomach acid and helps speed up the healing of the ulcer and the irritation as well. So both the cranesbill and the meadowsweet inhibit. I found some articles that demonstrate that the tannins that are found, also you're going to find tannins in oak and witch hazel, will likely do the same thing. But what it appears to do is the hydrogen potassium ATPase enzyme that's responsible for generating that acid in the stomach, that tannins in general appear to inhibit that enzyme. So that's one of the ways that it appears that it's probably going to block acid formation. Meadowsweet, it has astringent compounds in it as well. Also, there's an enzyme called histidine decarboxylase, which histidine is the amino acid that gets converted to histamine. And histamine is one of the messengers, not just for allergies, but also for stomach acid production. And so by blocking the formation of histamine, you're preventing the formation of one of the messengers that stimulates acid production in the stomach. So in addition, the meadowsweet appears to directly probably block these acid forming enzymes, and also the messenger as well, which is kind of cool. So I'm including this because I'm always curious, how do herbs act as antacids, or whatever the mechanism is, and here's an example of what I suspect is going on. So when it comes to laxatives, there's a few different ways that substances can promote a bowel movement. So a laxative in general is something that's going to promote bowel movements. An osmotic laxative does so by pulling more water into the bowel, and it does that by increasing the amount of solutes in the bowel to pull water in. You basically create an osmotic gradient. I'm sure if you guys have ever taken chemistry, and you should have, you know about osmosis and how it works. So if you have certain types of salts or things dissolved in water or blood or wherever it is, it creates it can create an osmotic gradient that can pull water into that area. So the way that it works is if you have things like magnesium, if you eat a whole bunch of magnesium, magnesium is a classic osmotic laxative. There's a certain amount of magnesium that if you consume it, your body can't absorb it, so it stays in the bowel, pulls water in. By doing that, it's going to hydrate the bowel, increase the volume, and then lead to a bowel movement. And if you take too much, it will lead to diarrhea. Now, certain sugars like sorbitol is an alcohol-based sugar that your body doesn't absorb. And it's going to be found in high amounts in prunes and kiwis, but also fruits in general and some berries. So the way that prune juice acts as a laxative is it's not doing that because it's rich in fiber. Because if you look at prune juice, it's not that viscous. It doesn't have a lot of fiber in it. It does that because the prunes have a lot of the sorbitol in it, the sugar in it. And the sugar is, because it's an alcohol sugar and we don't tend to break down and absorb these alcohol sugars, it will act like magnesium does. It remains in the bowel and then it sort of pulls water into it to have that osmotic effect. Now, just another thing, vitamin C, if you've ever taken, let's say, too much vitamin C, like a few thousand milligrams or 5,000 milligrams or more in a day, one of the things that ends up happening is your body cannot absorb all that vitamin C in a single dose. And as a result, like sugar, like the sorbitol and the magnesium remains in the bowels, pulls water in, causes loose stools and diarrhea. And finally, consuming sugar in excess in general will also act as an osmotic laxative. So that might be, let's say, if you have you eat a whole bunch of Halloween candy. So this will happen with kids. They eat a whole bunch of Halloween candy. They get a stomachache. Then they get some diarrhea from it. And that's just because even with glucose and fructose and everything else, your body's pretty good at absorbing it. But if you eat enough of it, you won't be able to absorb it. It's going to pull the water in. Your gut flora is going to ferment it. It's going to, and then that can produce a lot of gas, and then it can also produce diarrhea if it gets into the bowels and pulls all that water with it. As an aside, lactose, for people that are lactose intolerant, it acts as an osmotic laxative. So your body can't absorb the sugar from milk, and then it basically just pulls water in the bowel and promotes a bowel movement that way. Okay, so osmotic laxatives are pretty safe, generally speaking. Not a lot of harm with. They don't really have a drug-like effect. They're having more of a like a mechanical effect or a chemical effect in the bowels. Okay, just by redirecting water. So the idea here is you get all those little dots recommend some kind of dissolved solute like magnesium or some kind of sugar. When you have all those guys in there, it creates an osmotic gradient. So the amount of solutes outside the lumen of the bowel is less than what's inside the lumen. So as a result, water in your blood, for example, or in your body flows into the bowels, which can lead to dehydration as well. But then you get that, isotonic gradient there, or a solution there in the middle. So that's how osmotic laxatives work. Bulk laxatives work by a different mechanism. They are rich in fiber and have a bulking agent. They create volume in the stool using some kind of solid. So when you eat a lot of fiber, it absorbs water, it bulks up in there. And when it bulks up, it stimulates stretch receptors in the lumen of the bowel that helps to promote peristalsis. Okay, so fiber helps to hydrate the stool, making it more of a liquid, assuming you're drinking enough water with it. But it also stimulates those stretch receptors and has a positive way that way. So you can take bulk laxatives as a supplement. The classic supplement would be psyllium husk, and there's commercial products like Metamucil, which is high in psyllium. They add some other things to do it as well. Or you can just consume it in your diet. For example, adding ground flax or chia seeds to your breakfast is one way to increase the amount of soluble fiber that you're getting, and that can help promote bowel movements and act as a bulk laxative. Aloe gel, so not the resin, but sometimes you'll see there's aloe drinks that you can buy at the grocery store. The gel in it acts as a bulk laxative because of the fiber content. Even eating things like apples, the apple pectin, the fiber in the apple will act as a bulk laxative. So bulk laxatives are great from an evolutionary standpoint. We used to eat a lot of fiber, so we do need quite a bit of fiber in our diet to help promote bowel movements. And so making sure you're eating your fruits and vegetables is great, and supplementing with a little bit of psyllium or ground flax can help promote bowel movements. In addition to helping with constipation or preventing constipation, bulk laxatives can also be useful for acute diarrhea because the fiber absorbs water and turns it into gel. So that means that if you've got chronic diarrhea or acute diarrhea, or even chronic, just diarrhea in general, it will give you better stool consistency. So that, I appreciate, if I put up my hand like this and I pour a glass of water into my hand, it's all going to slip through my fingers. But if I add a whole bunch of Jello to the water and then pour the Jello into my hand, I'll be able to hold on to the Jello much more effectively than I can holding on to just pure water. So appreciate, if you have diarrhea, instead of going to the washroom 15 times a day, you might reduce it to 4 or 5 times. You're not suppressing the diarrhea, you're just giving the person better bowel control in general, which can help prevent accidents. Now, as an aside, if someone hasn't had a bowel movement in several days, I don't generally recommend giving a bulk laxative, because if you take a big bolus of fiber and it starts expanding your gut, if the bowels aren't moving downstream and you've got all this fiber trying to, push its way through, it's going to cause a lot of discomfort and gas. And it's kind of like if you're on the 401 and traffic is slowed down, you can't just go and get a big 18-wheeler truck and just drive, 100 kilometers an hour and try to push through it. It's just not going to help promote traffic, so to speak. So the bulk laxatives helps maintain the traffic, but it doesn't actually, it's not ideal if there's a traffic jam in your bowels per se. Okay, psyllium's on the left. There's the flax, pretty little flower, on the right, and the seeds from that are used as a bulk laxative and also as a food. And then a stimulating laxative works different than the bulk laxatives and the osmotic laxatives. It has more of a drug-like effect where it targets certain transporters in the lumen of the bowel to stimulate an influx. It basically helps promote an influx of water into the bowel and to stimulate peristalsis. In low doses, it can act as a laxative. In high amounts, it acts as a cathartic or a purgative, which basically means it violently kind of evacuates the bowels. So there are 2 main types of classes of compounds used to stimulate as a stimulating laxative. Castor oil, which is a non-anthraquinone containing drug. Castor oil does it through one mechanism, and then there's the anthraquinone herbs like senna aloe resin, which is different than aloe gel. Different varieties of buckthorn, the cascara, elder buckthorn, rhubarb root, and yellow dock. These all contain anthraquinone glycosides. Some of them are stronger than other ones. Yellow dock and rhubarb is a lot more gentle than senna is and aloe resin is, but they all have that stimulating effect. Let me just see. I don't know how many more slides I got before. Well, let's end it on slide 45, just because it's time to end, and we'll just finish the rest of this next week, and then we'll go on to discussing the herbs, some of the most common herbs used for the gastrointestinal tract. So do you guys have any questions before we wrap this up? You guys good? No questions? Then I will leave you guys for now. I hope you guys have a great week. Thank you. And we will see you next time. Okay? Bye for now.